For this session, please allow me the privilege to introduce your 5 stellar panel of experts. The first is Mr. Ahmad Shahriman Muhammad Sharif, Chief Executive Officer, CIMB Islamic Bank; Mr. Ijlal Alvi, Chief Executive Officer, International Islamic Financial Markets; and the third one, Mr. Yu Jin, Senior Vice President of Finance, Khazanah Nasional. And we have Mr. Bilal Kahloon, Partner, Trowers and Hamlins, and then of course Mr. Shamzani, Hussain, General Manager, Meethaq Islamic Banking Group, Bank Muscat, Sultanate of Oman. With that brief introduction, may I now invite Yang Berbahagia Professor Dato'Dr. Muhammad Azmi Omar, President of INCEIF, to kindly take up the role of a moderator. Over to you, Dato'.
Thank you, MC. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. And good afternoon to all distinguished panel members, participants. So again, welcome everyone to the second session of this afternoon, which is entitled Sukuk Market Opportunities and Challenges. If you read the recent IFSB Financial Stability Report 2021, it was reported that the overall Sukuk issuance by the end of 2020 stood at $163.4 billion. So $163.4 billion. This figure represents a 4% drop from the US dollars $171 billion. So that is a 4% drop from 2019 to 2020. As we know, the drop was mainly due to the COVID-19. And we see this particularly in the first half of last year. However, from the third quarter and fourth quarter of last year, we see there was an increase of Sukuk issuance, particularly coming from the sovereigns and of course corporates. And this is on the back of a lower interest rate due to the monetary policy implemented by many governments. Sovereigns were the main drivers of Sukuk issuance in 2020, followed by corporates as well as multilateral bodies. And Islamic Development Bank, for example, issued the Green Sukuk or Sustainable Sukuk way back in 2020. So in terms of sovereign Sukuk, we see some interesting development. The main issuers are first, government of Saudi Arabia. So Saudi government has been very active coming to the Sukuk market, 20.9% in terms of the overall percentage. Indonesia government, 19.4%. Third is Malaysia, 17.2%, followed by the government of Kuwait. So you see some new players coming to the market, very active, have been issuing sovereign Sukuk in the international market. Now for corporate Sukuk issuance, Malaysia still retains the #1 spot, followed by UAE, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And we see Turkey, for example, very active now in terms of the corporate issuance of Sukuk. However, one interesting aspect also we see is that as the importance of climate change and sustainability agenda being adopted and embraced by financial institutions, governments, and so on, we see an increasing trend of Sukuk issuance in that sector, the green and sustainability Sukuk. For example, according to IFSB, about slightly more than $3 billion of green Sukuk was issued in 2020. And it is expected that again, 2021, 2022 onwards, green Sukuk will be one of the main key issuance, not only from the sovereign side, but also from the corporate sector side. So to discuss these issues and to look at the post-recovery, because everyone expects, 2022 moving on and beyond, we will have post-COVID-19 recovery, although we do acknowledge that Omicron would be one of the factors. But again, I think we are now in the phase of what we call endemic. We live and we accept that COVID-19 will continue to be among us. The question is, how do we manage that risk? So to discuss the opportunities and challenges of Sukuk market, we have 5 distinguished speakers. 2 come from the Islamic financial services industry, from Islamic banks, 1 from Malaysia, the other one is from Oman. So the first this panel member is Shahriman Muhammad Sharif, the CEO of CIMB Islamic Bank. And second is Shamzani Muhammad Hussain, General Manager at the Meethaq Islamic Banking Group, Bank Muscat, Oman. Then we have from a standard setting body, Mr. Ijlal Alvi, Chief Executive Officer. And then we have also from an issuer, Eugene, the Senior Vice President of Finance, Khazanah Nasional. And finally, we have Bilal Khalon, a partner at the Trowers and Hamlins. So these individuals, we have a good mix of individuals. We have from the banking side or the advisory side, and we have from the standard setting body, we have the issuer side as well as from the legal side. So what I'm going to do is that I will start with Ijlal first, being a standard setting body, and IIFM has been producing, annual report on SUKUK. I think since I know that although in your website you mentioned 2011, but you issued earlier, even earlier than that, the SUKUK report, I remember in 2009. So you have been involved in the statistics, compiling and setting up standards for Islamic financial market. So tell us about what are the current SUKUK structures in the market, and then and how do you see, for example, the short-term SUKUK market, and what are the challenges that those issuers as well as the challenges in the market in general?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Honorable Professor Azmi, for the kind introduction. Yes, we have been, looking at the SUKUK market for some time now, as you mentioned. So many years have passed. It's indeed a pleasure to be part of this event, which I had been previously attending also in person, and I hope so in future we can do the same. Looking at the SUKUK market, which always said that industry growth prospects also, somehow gauged how the SUKUK market is developed and how it is performing. So during the COVID crisis also, the market itself has been resilient in one way or other. As per our own sort of SUKUK database and verification, and we have maybe some countries which may differ in some cases. We had about 174 billion of issuances. So this happens how you are taking into account certain figures. So this variation, sometimes some verifications are basically given to us. So out of that, if you look at it, first I would like to go into more on the short-term SUKUK side, which is very important from the liquidity management point of view, and how the industry sort of growth is also linked in many ways, development of a robust liquidity management purposes, short-term market. And what we had seen for 2020, they were around 33% of the SUKUK, or around 56 billion, were short-term SUKUK issuances from, I'll mention a few countries which have been active. So this is, I think, a higher percentage we have seen as compared to 2019. So although 2019 also short-term SUKUK were about 27%, so there is steady growth in the short-term SUKUK issuances. And we have also seen previously, if you see, historically, in 2001 to 2006, Bahrain started the short-term SUKUK issuances as first country, although Malaysia also started doing it, and they had dollar this short-term SUKUK, which were discontinued in 2006. And then there was a gap because mostly it was domestic currencies led by Malaysia, of course, and ringgit SUKUK, short-term SUKUK. And then we saw ILM in 2013 started issuing, and their share in terms of the issuances is increasing. So they had about 13 billion out of the 36 billion total share of international SUKUK issuances, and then around 40 billion is from the domestic markets. What we have also seen in terms of the countries which are issuing short-term SUKUK issuances is, of course, we have Malaysia, which has a larger share, and then you have this year also 2020, we had Turkey issuing number of short-term SUKUK issuances. So they had around, as per our data given to us, is around 20 billion of short-term SUKUK from Turkey came. And I will mention about the structure, what they generally use. And then we have countries like Bahrain, Indonesia also have some small share I think they're more on the long-term market side of it. And then you have, of course, Brunei, which started issuing, its capital market through short-term sukuk. And then we have some other countries, few other countries like, smaller size, like Bangladesh, from Africa, Sudan has been always issuing, of course, sukuks. And then we have Gambia also issuing some sukuk. So this is generally, if you look at it, the sukuk short-term market, it's pretty much very few countries are really active. So that's where I think something needs to be looked at it. Some other countries, which I may not have mentioned, they issue, but the volumes are not really, that great in terms of the short-term sukuk issuances. And then in terms of type of issuers, and then we see during 2000, financial crisis, that at that time, your corporate side was more active at that time, and sovereign were at that time, as per my memory say, was less active. But then since then, and we used to say, maybe sovereigns should drive the market. And since then, we have seen, sovereigns are the key drivers. So you have in sovereign and quasi-sovereign for short-term sukuk, we have financial institutions which regularly issue sukuks, may not be in some cases short-term, but they are active there. And then if you look at from the short-term, ex-Malaysia, we don't have that many corporate side sukuk issuances. So I think generally we see in the sukuk market that you are sort of, whether you are looking at the long-term market or you're looking at short-term, the role ex-Malaysia, I would say, because you have a very deep market in Malaysia. You have corporates which are not really performing, in my view, as per the potential it possesses. And there could be several reasons which we can, inshallah, cover. But also one reason is also the economic cycle when it goes through. Naturally, corporates, their activity, sometime are curtailed. And these days, of course, there are many issues which they face, including the supply chain. Looking at sort of the point on the structure breakdown. First, I would like to just mention briefly, it's the short-term sukuk side. You see, in 2020, of course, there were more ijara sukuk, mainly because of Turkey, because they issued mostly ijara-based sukuks, even for short-term. You have Bahrain also, they issue dinar-based, Bahraini dinar, short-term salam sukuk also, and some ijara sukuk as well. But, share of Turkey was larger, so you had more ijara-based sukuk structure being used. But overall, if you see, it's always been the murabah, which is used. And in my view, there are a few reasons for that. One reason is the credit intensiveness, which it provides the structure, to structure. It also sort of provide, in some cases, when you are looking at short-term market, generally, even in long-term, we have a supply gap issue. Demand is higher than the supply. But short-term, generally, in many ways, in many countries, the murabah is not tradable, but it is kept for more liquidity. So maybe that could be one of the reasons, I think, generally, where the structure is mostly, tilted towards murabah in many ways. And then you have, if you look at overall, the market as a whole, we have seen, and generally for long-term sukuk also, you have now wakala sukuk, or in some ways you can say combination sukuk, which are also being quite widely used now, and that structure combination is quite prevalent these days, given certain in terms of the asset availability and all. And we see, of course, there are tangibility ratios and all, which one has to mention and have to kept in mind. But we have wakala also being used, and then you have to lesser extent, in terms of financial institutions when they're issuing, especially from the GCC region. For the tier 1, you have mudarba sukuks, which are quite common here, and some good size sukuks were issued in 2020 also, and even in 21. So that is also quite a common. And then you have other structure like Musharaka, which is not used that much, but that's also sometimes plays. And then, you have structure like views of istisna, which I think is another area for us to see, because, project financing based sukuk and all have been issued, but not really that many. And then finally, if you look at the green sukuk side also, as per our figures, the structure-wise, naturally they use the same structure, so you don't really have a different structure if you have a socially responsible sukuks or green sukuk, but the structure could be the same, which I mentioned. But there are about 20 billion of sukuk issuances for the green area. And one point, just final point I would like to mention from the IIFM perspective, and we see, one issue which is raised often for sukuk is the standardization, and that's something which always, been mentioned. Maybe that it's too costly in some cases to issue sukuk in various jurisdictions. So from our side, IIFM, we have issued 2 documentation standards concerning sukuk, which can be referred from our website also. So one is the Ijara sukuk, which we have done, and other one is the Mudaraba sukuk. So these are the 2 which we have published since last year, and Mudaraba was done earlier this year. So we are sort of looking at to fill that gap, and I think the other sort of documentation can follow, and there are other sort of areas which often been talked about, issue based on the asset backed sukuks and all that's always been said. And that's, in my view, is a different market, but that's another area one can look in terms of documentation or combination sukuk documentation. So these are all things which hopefully will inshallah help the market.
Okay, thank you very much for giving the overall perspective of the sukuk, the kind of structure and the short-term sukuk, and the role that IIFM has played in terms of coming up with the standards. I think from having an overall perspective, a global perspective, we now go to regional perspective. So first, I would like to invite Shahriman Muhammad Sharif, the CEO of CIMB Islamic. I think we'll be talking about in the context of the sukuk market in Malaysia as well as Southeast Asia. So Shahriman, if you can elaborate on that, and then how do you contrast, say, for example, the Malaysian market versus, say, for example, the other markets in this region? Yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Assalamualaikum and Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum to fellow panelists. Of course, I'm happy to be here joining my other fellow panelists today to discuss on this topic. I think today, really my focus for this panel, I really want to put a bit more emphasis on maybe the opportunities of where we can, areas that we can look at. Less on the structure. I know there's a lot of debate, discussion on sukuk structures and so on, but really my focus right now is really on the use of proceeds and how we can actually use the sukuk as an instrument of change for pressing global matters. So I think from that perspective, especially in the ASEAN region, I think there are 2 areas where the developments are quite critical. One is climate finance, because this is an area that for us in the tropics that affects us greatly. We are also mostly coastal nation, so if this is not mitigated, it will have severe impact on the nations of in ASEAN and so on. And number 2, the social impact. How can we use sukuk as a force to make social change and whatnot? So I think those are the 2 areas, I think I want to talk a bit more when it comes to the use of sukuk in the region, in ASEAN in particular. Now, on climate finance, I think based on the proceedings of COP26, I think the funding requirement is quite immense. I think a lot of numbers have been thrown about. I think US is committing about 1.7 trillion to overall effort on climate change and whatnot. I think, and the commitment between the developed countries, the original commitment that was set in 2009 was the developed countries are supposed to transfer to the developing countries about 100 billion a year for developed countries to actually start making changes and whatnot, to adapt and mitigate. But I think given the constant underfunding, I think that number has gone up. So there's actually a bottom line is there's a lot of money needs to be poured quickly into the areas of climate finance and to allow countries, developed countries to change and convert their economies in order for us to actually stop climate change. So I think that's the most pressing issue, and we don't really have a lot of time because based on the trajectory that we are heading now, the 1.5%, change in what I call this, the global warming, that looks likely to be happening given that our inability to actually stop this, to fulfill our own commitments for the last few years. So from that perspective, I think what we are quite keen to look at is how do we use SUKUK in a few areas. One is transition finance or transition SUKUKs. We've not seen any, especially in Malaysia, and we are working closely with regulators and so on, say what can we do, simply because we have had a green SUKUK framework for quite some time. But what we realize when we engage clients, not just in Malaysia, but also in the region, it might be a bridge too far for most of the corporates that we want to work with. It's not that they do not want to convert, they do want to convert. They want to convert, they want to contribute to climate change. But it might be the standards are set that they might not qualify for such treatment. And as a result, you have an inactivity. People do not make the change. People actually fail to use the framework to actually fund the change. So I think it's quite critical that we work on a transition SUKUK framework in order for us to start getting our corporates in the ASEAN region to start finance the change towards reducing the emissions, the contribution towards emissions. So I think that's one priority I see both in Malaysia and Indonesia, very, very relevant. The second, when it comes to climate finance, the second area where we're quite keen to actually also use SUKUK is also to see how we can exploit or how we can use SUKUK as an instrument to deliver initiatives such as the REDD scheme. So REDD scheme, which is the reduction in emissions through deforestation and degradation of forests, that basically transfers what we call that basically monetize the forests that we have in the region and so on, calculate the value, the offset value that the forests that we have in the region, and that in turn is funded by countries which are what we call this creating emissions. So that kind of framework is already in existence, but we have yet to come up with a SUKUK that's able to take advantage of that framework. How do we facilitate and how do we monetize the forest resources and so on? Because I think these two efforts, for me, I've been quite consistent in this messaging in various forums. I said that, look, let's not nitpick. Let's not try to be whatever effort that we can put in order to contribute towards the what I call this, stopping climate change. We should put our best foot forward. We should focus on it, big or small, all out. We should go. We need to put in action in order for us to stop climate change, right? So I think these are two big areas which personally we are looking at and see where we can use SUKUK as a tool to make the change. The other part, the other piece, which is quite important as well for the region, is on the social finance piece, because the pandemic really has impacted the livelihoods of people in the region. I think Malaysia alone, I think, Prof, you're quite aware, the statistics, even our middle class, a big chunk of our middle class has actually been pushed back to become to the bottom B40 category, because of the change in income and so on. And it's same throughout the region. And and globally, I think the estimates by UN, more than 500 million of the world's population has actually been pushed back towards poverty. So again, and how are we able to use SUKUK as a device or to what call this, to address these issues? How do we promote how do we help assist those most severely impacted? There's few interesting issuances that happen in the region. I think we had in Malaysia, we had SUKUK Prihatin. Interestingly, where you actually can actually opt to not get the repayment from the SUKUK, whereby you can then actually contribute towards social initiatives and whatnot run by the government. In Indonesia, the cash-linked wakaf SUKUK that was also launched last year, very interesting, because again, similarly, you can the income from the SUKUK is actually channeled to the wakaf, various wakaf for social social benefit. But at the same time, you also have the situation whereby you can also again opt. You do not want. You can donate whatever the principal amount in perpetuity to the wakaf. So all these instruments, I think, is very, very useful because we need to, similar to climate change, we need to mobilize resources from all segments of society for the greater good. And I think this is, where SUKUK plays a very, very powerful role, especially in the ASEAN region. Because
sorry, if I were to interject you, since you're mentioning about SUKUK, but you notice that, for example, Indonesia has more retail SUKUK versus Malaysia, with the exception of SUKUK Prihatin. So how do you see that differences? Is there a way to bridge?
So I think that's actually, from Azmi, I think that is actually a very positive development, because the way I see it, it goes back to what I mentioned. We need to mobilize all parts of society. So in Indonesia, you can clearly see the participation, the retail participation. People are actually shifting their own savings and so on, and contributing their own savings towards what I call this social causes. In Malaysia, it's traditionally the market has been developed more from a top-down institutional focus. I think what we need is actually full spectrum of investors. We need the retail as well as the large institutions. The large institution can focus on the bigger projects, and whereas the smaller participants and so on can focus on the smaller projects that might be more localized, because a lot of the social initiatives, if you think about it, the proceeds will be localized, the impact will be localized. So I think if you want to match the in terms of the impact, social finance most likely will be a retail consideration, because people can put money into the retail sukuk, which is linked to a social cost that's directly impacting them either in the region. It could be a hospital in the area, it could be a development project in their area, because that's how we see the nature of social finance being worked, because a lot of the projects are a bit more localized.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we move on to Shamzani. I mean, he's based in Oman, Muscat. I mean, he will be able to share with us in the context of the Oman market plus the GCC market. But how do you see, for example, the challenges of the sukuk market, Shamzani, in terms of the Oman GCC, as well as a bit about the ESG sukuk? Is there opportunity to expand more of ESG sukuk within the region?
Thank you, Prof. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Thank you so much to the organizer, the partners, as well as the sponsor for having me in this session. So, I would start by saying that, over the last few years, the sukuk market in the GCC region, in absolute terms, have done equally well as the conventional peers. However, in contrast to conventional peers, on a risk adjustment basis, the sukuk market has significantly outperformed the conventional peers. So, for example, despite the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact of the liquidity shock in the credit market, as well as the oil price crisis, the extent of sell down in the sukuk market is considerably lower than what we saw on the conventional side. As we are all aware, part of the reason for this is that investors tend to hold the sukuk papers till maturity, given the lack of suitable alternate Sharia compliant instruments, especially in GCC. Having said that, over the last 4 to 5 years, we have seen the region's market share of sukuk decrease from approximately 40% to around 20% today. This is mainly due to the pandemic, I would say, that has curbed the requirement and appetite for additional liquidity. On a positive note, we have already seen several sovereigns, multilateral financial institutions and corporate benchmark issuances in 2021, such as the government of Oman, $1.75 billion issuance, the Islamic Development Bank, USD 2.5 billion issuance, the Dubai Islamic Bank, 1 billion issuance, and also, the mega Saudi Aramco USD 6 billion issuance taking place in 2021. So hence, I foresee the market witnessing a gradual increase in the number of new issuances, particularly from sovereigns and financial institutions, as the GCC economies move into recovery mode. In the medium term, I would say from an Oman perspective, the Omani sukuk market is expected to excel because the Sukuk credibility as a good investment opportunity is always there. So this, combined with the rapid recovery of the Oman economy, especially post-COVID-19, should create a strong demand from both the buy side as well as the sell side. Also, the positive recovery in oil price, as well as the various fiscal measures being introduced by the government, such as VAT and rationalizing spending, all these will contribute and expected to benefit from an improved overall credit rating, which will, at the end of it, trigger the reduction in borrowing costs in the capital market space, hence making new sukuks as well as debt issuances more attractive. I would also say that we have also started seeing corporate sukuks coming to the market, and we expect this trend to continue as corporates seek to diversify their local funding sources and explore alternative options. And also another point is, it's noteworthy that to say that the Oman as a market has witnessed the sukuk instruments being used to facilitate financial inclusion, especially for retail investors. So, for example, Meethaq, for example, we have actually pioneered the issuance of retail sukuk in Oman. We've issued 2 retail sukuk issuances to date, and the third one, is projected to be issued in the second quarter of 2022. So, so there's loads of positive news, I would say, from the GCC, moving into 2022 onwards.
But you see, just to touch base also with you, Ijlal mentioned earlier on about, the short-term sukuk, corporate sukuk. So how do you see short-term corporate sukuk in Oman or within the region generally?
Yes, I would say that, the shorter-term corporate sukuk, mainly, those up to 3 years, would be quite attractive. The reason is because, in countries, or certain jurisdictions such as Oman, the pricing as well as the demand, for short-term instruments, especially post-COVID, has seen a much higher sort of attractiveness compared to before. So we are seeing, shorter-term corporate sukuks, as a good alternate to the other types of debt instruments, over the next maybe 2 to 3 years.
Okay. Then I want to relate, lastly, I want to relate to what Shahriman mentioned earlier on about the climate change. The GCC countries are mainly oil and gas producing countries. Is there any plan, for example, to address climate change through sukuk issuance?
Yes, I think what I would like to touch is coming back to your question on climate change is the developments on SDG and ESG compliant instruments. So I think that's where I think the whole sort of trend is going into, and on that note, we do foresee for the region as well as Oman, for this trend to actually take a faster pace. Of course, demand and pricing considerations will undoubtedly be the key drivers for the development of ESG and SDG sukuk sphere. But while some of the incentives that appeal to ESG investors in other jurisdictions may not necessarily extend to the region or to Oman, there's certainly, I would say, a growing awareness and understanding of ESG in the region. Especially from a Sharia perspective, and this, has heightened the interest and role ESG or SDG can play, in the Islamic debt capital market and Islamic financial transactions. From various industry publications, I would say, I've seen that there are strong appetite for investors, with more than maybe $1 trillion, the last I saw, of funds globally potentially searching for such issuances. So I would highlight at this point that the Capital Markets of Authority and the Capital Markets Authority of Oman has also been instrumental in developing the proper framework to facilitate DSG and ESG compliant issuances. So I believe my dear brother Kamal Rizadi from the Oman Capital Markets Authority will be deliberating in more depth on this in this session later, inshallah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we move on to Eugene. from Khazanah, VP Finance. Khazanah has been issuing sukuk, the plain vanilla sukuk to the SRI sukuk. Tell us, what are the factors that you decide to go towards, say, for example, ESG SRI sukuk? Is there a specific consideration that you put in place? And then how do you foresee Khazanah moving forward in terms of being the, a regular sukuk issuer?
Sure. Thanks, Prof. I guess everything we do goes back to our purpose, and our purpose is to generate sustainable value for Malaysians, being a sovereign fund. So I guess in that respect, ESG and sustainability is core to ensuring that value we can generate sustainable value. And therefore, I think back in 2015 and then 2015 and 2017, we issued 2 tranches of our social impact sukuk to fund education in Malaysia. The unique thing, I was just listening to everyone, right? And I'm not a market expert, unlike everyone on this panel. And I was thinking a lot of things that I've learned as an issuer in Islamic finance and issuing sukuk is actually quite applicable to what we do with ESG today. Certain things like, in the past we talked about negative screening. Islamic finance, there's permissible activities, and then there is things like not taking excessive risk. That's actually some convergence there with what we discuss in ESG and sustainability. And I think as an issuer, I use the experience adopting, convincing my management to adopt those principles. That would be the same experience that I take to my board and management now, to tell them why we're adopting ESG and sustainability. That experience through transitioning to Islamic finance makes it easier for us now to adopt ESG, and there's a lot of convergent points. The second thing as well, Islamic finance, I think the earlier panel was talking about the Standard 59 and monitoring Sharia compliance of certain assets. I guess that's also applicable, right? So when we were issuing sukuk, we had to set up structures within our organization to monitor whether or not assets were compliant to certain financial ratios, for example. And then annually, we have to monitor what assets are Sharia compliant for us to use in our asset-based financing. That kind of discipline and setting up that kind of structure can also be applied when we look at ESG and we look at what assets fall in that category. And then lastly, I guess transitioning, I think 20 plus years ago, we helped a lot of our investee companies transition from conventional finance to Islamic finance. For example, the highway concession or Plus, initially all their debt was funded in conventional, but gradually we've substituted with Islamic finance. So overall, if you Malaysia and a lot of other countries that have gone through the whole process of understanding Islamic finance, there's a lot of learning points that we can use to adopt ESG and sustainability-linked finance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to add further, if you look in terms of the tenor of your sukuk, just again to meet what Ijlal is saying earlier on, as a standard setting body, they would like to see more of the short-term sukuk, for liquidity purposes and so on. So do you have a specific policy, for example, how many percent are the short term, how many percent are medium term, and how many percent are long term sukuk?
Sure. I guess with all issuers, the commercial aspects of it takes precedence. So it's always dependent on our maturity profile and our investment requirements. And also because again, because of the principles of not taking excessive risk, we have ALM ratios in place to ensure we don't bucket all our debt in one particular year, so that we don't have refinancing we don't have refinancing or liquidity risk. Mm-hmm. So that actually determines how we decide on tenors.
Okay, just to follow up, the other, even earlier panel were talking about all this, the Sharia Standard 59. How do you, as Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, when you issue an international sukuk, how do you consider all those factors in, or are you just using the Malaysian Sharia standards?
Sure. So back in May, when we did our $1 billion sukuk, we actually had an issue with this because at that time it was still relatively unclear, and luckily we had good advisors. CIMB CIMB Islamic, I guess Shahriman would know what was advising us on this transaction. And I think that there were two things that we were very clear about. Number one is that we cannot change the terms and conditions of the Sukuk too much, because then investors will need time to accept. And then secondly, we still have to address the concerns of particularly UAE investors. So what we did is we maintained the language that the wakil, we did the wakalah Sukuk, that the wakil, upon realizing that the asset value may breach the tangibility threshold, will advise us, and then we will top up the value. I accept the fact that this might not be something palatable for all issuers, but as a sovereign fund, we have a reputation as a Islamic finance issuer. So we have something at stake to ensure that we'll definitely top up the value.
Okay. So who are your investors in this particular case? If you can give a broad breakdown.
Sure. We actually had 180 investors across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. I think in the Middle East, we did have UAE investors. We had about 16 to 20 Middle Eastern investors across 2 tranches. Yeah.
Okay. So again, it's fairly spread out in that context. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Since you mentioned about this, now I would like to move to Bilal. Being somebody from a legal background, legal firm, and one of the issues that we face today, especially if you want to get the Sukuk standards to be, Sukuk to be standardized, the standards to be accepted by all, is one of the most challenging issue is the Sharia Standard 59. And the issue of assets, the issue of sale of debt, murabah, and so on. So how do you see, Bilal, for example, what can you explain first the Sharia Standard 59, and then what are the implications to Sukuk issuer if they were to go, especially for Malaysian companies, to go abroad?
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Azmi. Just in terms of Standard 59, essentially, it relates to the sale of debt. And in particular, if I were to talk about Sukuks in particular, how it impacts them is it goes to a number of factors that you would typically see in the documentation. But the key factor would be the tangibility ratio. And I know that Eugene sort of touched upon it just now as well. But typically what we had in the past before the standard was that the issuer was required at the onset of an issuance to ensure that the assets were above a 50% threshold. And how that standard has sort of changed things is that the issuer is now required to ensure that those assets are maintained for the life of the Sukuk. And if the threshold falls below a particular threshold, which is about 33%, then that triggers dissolution events and related sort of put options that the investors have. So it's significantly sort of changed from a documentation perspective, a number of sort of elements within the documents that we've been seeing for a number of years. And I think with the adoption of the Standard 59 by the Higher Sharia Authority of the Central Bank of UAE, what you're seeing is a lot of investors based in the UAE would now need to see the adoption of Standard 59 within the documents in order for them to participate. So, it has had, I think, over the course of the last year, a significant sort of impact on the documents. And I think as investors become more familiar with the documents, more familiar with the standards, I think it'll just get easier, but it has had an impact over the short to medium term, I would say, in terms of the size of issuances.
Thank you. I mean, for example, for Malaysian companies, for example, Malaysian corporates wanting to issue a global Sukuk, what would be your advice in this case, if they want to meet that Standard 59?
For Malaysian companies that are looking to tap international markets, and UAE investors form a fairly sizable chunk of the international Sukuk investors, there they would need to ensure, compliance with Standard 59, because from a regulatory perspective, UAE investors that are regulated by the central bank would not be able to participate unless Standard 59 is complied with. So I think even if you're not based within the region, but you're looking to tap into UAE investors, then Standard 59 will always, be something that you would need to consider. And I think, Eugene sort of touched on that just now in terms of when they were looking to do it. And naturally, there will be different elements to that that interpretation, from the the hard dissolution event scenarios, which naturally from a issuer perspective, you've got a risk of early dissolution because of failing to meet tangibility ratios, and as a result of that, liquidity issues and sort of ratings issues and all of that comes with it. But sorry, just to answer your question, I think if you're looking to do an international issuance, and if you're looking to tap into a large investor base which is based in the UAE or regulated by the UAE, then you would need to adopt or look closely at Standard 59.
Thank you. Do you think, say, for example, other countries in the region will be adopting the Standard 59?
I think so. I think so. I mean, with the drive to standardization that we're talking about, and there is that effort which has been going on for a number of years now towards standardization. And I think, given the size of the investor base and the size of the issuers out of the UAE, it will logically sort of develop into other markets as well.
Thank you. Now I want to move back to Ijlal, because being a standard setting body, you have been, as you mentioned earlier on, you work on Ijara as well as the Mudarabah SUKUK documentation. What are your thoughts on the standardization, particularly on 59, and how will it impact, say, for example, issuers in the region, your region for GCC, and subsequently the other parts of the world?
Yes, I think, as rightly mentioned, Brother Bilal, naturally, the tangibility ratios, not meeting them is something which, is major component now, and, increasing it to around 51% of tangible assets. So these are, I think, some things which are, previously was more sort of in a fluid form. So that's, I think, now becoming more clearer in terms of doing it. And the way we look at it is, of course, we when we develop our standards, we use AOFI standards in particular as a reference, as a basis. So when we develop, so we refer to that. Of course, we have our own Sharia board which approves. There are certain elements which we do have to look at it when you are issuing documentation and SUKUK. So that's something which we do. And I think in some sort of places, maybe the compliance of 59 may not be as what is in UAE at the moment. So some countries, maybe they will still keep it as per their own Sharia. I think that's something which we see. Of course, overall, from standard setting body point of view, I think it's something which from the industry development perspective, we should look into that and try to come closer, if not completely, what is being sort of prescribed. So that's what I see. That's different sort of jurisdictions have different sort of approach within the region also. So this is something which I think, in my view, probably will continue. That's how I see, but maybe other countries can follow.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just to move further is that, what do you see the prospects of SUKUK, for example, in 2022 and beyond, and particularly the role of IIFM in terms of standardization, in coming of certain standards and so on?
Yes, I think if you look at that question, and there is some question came already, one can look into from 59. It's more on the commodity murabaha, mechanism when we issue sukuk, and as I earlier mentioned, in some cases, especially this part of world, commodity murabaha, based sukuks are not tradable. That's something which I think we should keep in mind. That is the case. And your question, Prof, can you again repeat that, please?
No, for example, I mean, we know that given the standard 59, it can be an opportunity as well, also a challenge to many organizations. You as a standard setting body, what do you see, for example, sukuk issuance, sukuk market in 2022 and beyond? And what would be the role of IIFM in terms of coming up with new standards?
Yes, well, that's a very valid question. First, if you look at it, from overall point of view, our Sharia board also have prescribed that even if the sukuk is issued, let's say from the corporate, then the Sharia monitoring should be there to see the assets are there, and if they fall, then should be topped up or there should be done. And I think one issue which was raised, maybe Brother Bilal can mention, was that even if threshold levels are reached and they come lower, but there is always a time frame which is generally available for the sukuk issuer to basically overcome that reduction in assets. From our side, we are looking at the moment, of course, we work based on the recommendation to sort of further strength, is two sort of documentation, which probably, inshallah, we might be able to issue in next 1 or 2 years, would be looking at the asset-backed side of, and that's a different market in my view, because you have sukuk which are totally linked to the asset-backed, and they have a discipline requirement. So they are generally, let's say you have a requirement for now, various form. You have alternative to repo. So these are done also now in the market, which is very important for the liquidity management. And if you have an asset-backed, naturally that doesn't fit into those sort of requirement of that. So you will continue. The one we will look into the asset-backed, inshallah, the documentation. And the other one we are looking at is the combination sukuk documentation. And these are the two from our side at the moment. We are looking at it.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, coming back to Shahriman, what do you see the prospects of the sukuk market in Malaysia and in the region? And is there any expansion, particularly on the ESG sustainability side?
Yeah. So I think definitely next year is going to be a busy year for the region. I mean, look at the reports and the forecast and whatnot. I mean, one is you have the natural maturity. So I think when we look at the numbers in terms of sukuk maturing in the region, Malaysia alone has about 138 billion ringgit worth of maturities, right? So there's a lot of, most of it are short term, but there's also quite a number of long term issuances in that number. And I think global sukuk itself, you're talking about 38 billion maturities, so those need to be refinanced and whatnot. So that's one. The second piece is most of the you see next year as the economy recovers, the corporates will start to also reinvest, and reinvestment will require financing, and I think they go to a bank or capital market. So from the looks of it, our sense is quite a number of issuances will be coming to the capital markets, because after sitting on the sidelines for the last 2 years, most corporates are coming in. And then the third piece is even on the government, because infrastructure spending is coming, right? Malaysia, you talk about RMK 12, and then Indonesia has its own what call this infrastructure development plans as well. So that's coming in. So what mitigates that, or in terms of prospect, less relevant for Malaysia, Indonesia, in the region, but more for I think the oil prices going up, I think that kind of mitigate the need, especially in the GCC, for especially on the sovereign side, to raise funding to the sukuk market. But I think for Malaysia, Indonesia, while all revenues are important, I think our demands in terms of development demands and so on, you still see a positive upswing in what calls our SUKUK issuances. So I think based on the reports and the trends that we're seeing, it looks very positive. A lot of numbers are bandied about. Some are saying about 10% higher than where we're going to close this year. We don't have our own forecast, but what we can see from the general corporate activity, general government activity, I think that it should be around there. That's the sense that it's going to fulfill. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Shamzani, same question. What are you thinking in the 2022 and beyond? You are muted, please. Okay.
Sure, thank you, Prof. 2022 and beyond into the medium term, we believe, for the GCC and Oman, the SUKUK market, is, expected to drive strong demand, as I mentioned, from issuers as well as, from investors. There are various factors to this. I think, the positive recovery in oil price, as well as the various fiscal measures, as I mentioned before, being introduced by governments, and the level of rationalization in terms of, the management of fiscal measures, rationalization in spending, will all benefit, both the issuers as well as the investors, in terms of, reaping into, the better credit ratings, not just by Oman, but I think also several jurisdictions in the GCC. Hence making new SUKUKs and refinancing activities as well as debt issuances, more attractive. So we are anticipating for the sovereigns in the region to continue tapping the local and international markets in 2022, 23, 24, and 25 onwards. This will continue to be, one of the core means to support the government funding needs, particularly from expenditure and infrastructure development perspective. With this, it will create, a proper benchmark for, for the corporates as well as other institutions to follow.
Okay, thank you very much. Eugene, again, as an issuer, I mean, Khazanah has been coming to the market regularly. What do you see, for example, 2022 and beyond? Would there be a shift towards ESG, for example, or still following the same trend?
Definitely, there's a tilt towards ESG and sustainability. But I think issuers are all the same, right? It's all about ensuring that they secure funding and the pricing for the funding is reasonable. But of course, overlaying that, there'll be a tilt towards ESG. And for Khazanah, SUKUK will still be our preferred method of financing. And yeah, we'll continue to see what they has to offer.
Thank you. I have a question here from the members of the audience. It's a long question, but again, I will open it to all of you. I have a humble question for presenters. I mean, if you can see the question, why do the policymaker, which means that the policymakers regulate the policy for investors or SUKUK holders to barter with ESG credits in exchange for green SUKUK payments? So which essentially means you create a market for the ESG credit with coupon, for example, paid periodically. Is there something possible to do that?
Prof, maybe I just can take a stab at that question. I think excellent question, because those are principally what the question from the floor is alluding to is actually a pricing mechanism, right?
Yes.
When you say ESG credits, I mean, what we're looking at, especially on the climate front, is carbon pricing and pricing the cost of emission, pricing the cost of pollution, right? How much carbon that you offset, how much carbon that you generate, and how much your ability to absorb. So I think that framework has gone quite a fair bit in the conventional space, and I think that's I think primarily where we're looking at whether we can adopt that framework to the issuance of SUKUK. So then it comes out with Sharia issues, right? What is carbon from the perspective of Sharia, right? How when you price out carbon emission, there's also a lot of practical problems measuring how much carbon has been generated and so on. Another part too is a carbon tax, but that's more from a government perspective. But when it comes to SUKUK, capital markets and so on, pricing the emissions, that is actually really what the question is about. And that is, yeah, that's spot on. That work has actually been taken place now. Yeah.
So what's the progress like? For example, is there something that you will see, say, for example, towards the third or fourth quarter of next year?
Okay, so the problem is I won't give a timeline simply because when it comes to carbon pricing, so it also relates to national policy and regulation. I think Malaysia alone, the recent budget announcement, I think we have a voluntary carbon scheme. Again, it's not mandatory and so on. So how that will work in terms of pricing and whatnot, those are something that we need to work out. So bottom line, it's not something that the market can do it on its own without involvement or changes in government policy or to give rise to a price to emissions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other takers for this question? Shamzani, you would like to share your thoughts on this?
I have just short and sweet. I think given that the the Sharia governance what you call guidelines is very much in line with the ESG SDG. If you look at it, the market forces itself, I would say, will actually dictate where the pricing will be heading into. So there's a lot of attractiveness in here, and I believe that will actually determine the price for for ESG, SDG.
Okay, thank you. Eugene, you want to contribute to this idea, this point?
Actually, not really.
Okay. What about Bilal? Any thoughts on this?
No, nothing further from me on this.
Oh, okay, fine. Let me get back to you, Bilal. Particularly, there's a question from one of the members here. The relevance of Standard 59 with SUKUK and its issuance. If you can elaborate a bit on this. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, there's a number of elements to this. I mean, Standard 59 essentially talks about the sale of debt. Now, that sort of impacts Murabaha transactions and the way that those are structured currently or used to be structured with the use of subsequent Murabaha transactions, so that you're effectively trying to roll over debt that you would otherwise do in a conventional financing. So there's been sort of it has had an impact on that as well. But from a SUKUK perspective, naturally, the impact has been more on the tangibility thresholds. And as well as wherever SUKUK structures involve Murabahas, naturally, that has had a carry-on effect onto that as well. And, as Brother Ijlal sort of mentioned earlier as well, in terms of the tradability of SUKUK, especially if they follow a Murabaha format, has been difficult or not possible at all. But from a standard perspective, it does have impact for Murabaha transactions and the ability to roll over those transactions. But what we're seeing in the documentation is that there are ways that you can effectively overcome that to ensure that you are in compliance with that standard. So, the documentation can be tweaked to ensure compliance with the requirements of that standard for Murabaha transactions. But
can you elaborate on that part? How do you tweak, for example? How do you resolve that? Because of the rollover part, particularly. Yeah.
Correct. So effectively, the idea is that, because you're looking to roll over debt, the way that we've seen it being resolved in documentations is actually having the rollover start before the actual or during the actual payment period for the previous Murabaha transaction. So that's where the actual debt is actually paid and then reborrowed effectively, if you want to use that term. But from an Islamic deferred payment perspective, right, the amount is due, and then you have another Murabaha transaction, which takes the deferred payment date forward to a particular date. You've got other sort of features that are coming into the market as well by having sort of a long deferred payment date for one Murabaha transaction, and then having shorter Murabaha transactions, which look to cover the Murabaha margin or profit element for it. So there's a number of different variations to it, but the most common one that we're seeing is to align the Murabaha profit periods such that they begin before the previous Murabaha transaction, which is being rolled over.
Okay, thank you. Maybe now back to Eugene. I mean, I see you were nodding with what what Bilal was saying. So maybe you can share how you did it in terms of meeting that requirement.
Actually, we in the Wakalah agreement for our recent issuance, it's just stated that we will top up to 51%, but it's not a hard written covenant. It's actually on the advice of the Wakil that Khazanah as Obligo will top up the tangible assets to 51%. I think if a stricter interpretation, we actually investors might actually shy away if there's a stricter interpretation. But at that time, we had to balance between catering to that group of investors versus how it will affect the rest of my investors. Because if I were to put something like a dissolution event for the tangible assets dropping below 33%, then I shut out a bigger group, a huge group, actually almost all investors who are, who don't have to comply with standard 59.
Okay, let me go back to Shahriman here, because I mean CIMB is one of the advisor in terms of this SUKUK. Yes.
So probably, I mean, with Eugene's permission, of course, as it I think it was timing wise, it was quite early on. I mean, again, this is not like right now. We have few more months after the standard has been issued. So Khazanah had a few time constraints in their hands. But as Eugene rightly pointed out, or what we tried to, Khazanah tried to fulfill as much as possible the new standards. But at the end of the day, as he put it mildly just now, if it's a stricter look, then we're not sure. But what we did, what Khazanah did very well was actually to engage every single investor, especially in the region and so on, and it was explained clearly what we are able to do in the issuance, and what we so where are the gray areas and whatnot. So that I think bottom line is what Brother Ijlal was saying earlier. There are many types of investors in the GCC. UAE, one block, of course, is a significant chunk, but in the other parts of GCC, not everyone will follow the IOF standard strictly. But I think right now, in the interim, our approach is be transparent. We explain what we can be met and what we met. Because again, the Khazanah program is not a new one. I mean, so that was the issue as well. And we have also an existing pool of investors that we need to take care of. But maybe for new issuances, then they have somebody who's starting new or fresh from a clean slate. They might not have the issues that Khazanah as an issue faced earlier. Yeah.
Thank you. We are towards the end, the tail end. We have about 4 minutes. I would like to give 1 minute each to every one of you. What are your messages to our participants here, our audience, in terms of the SUKUK market? So I'll start with Ijlal first.
Thank you, Prof. The one thing is, just very quickly, before I move to the question, is that we have published two basically solutions for the Murabaha, which fit 59. It's more targeted towards the global benchmark rate and risk-free rates. But there are two solutions. One is used in Malaysia. I will not go into detail, and one other solution which was mentioned. So there are solutions which can be used for Murabaha, I'm mentioning.
Thank you.
And for Jara. As far as I think from our perspective, the way I see, of course, 22 still looks, I think, for SUKUK market a good year. But I see more sort of focus now going towards the ESG part. I think more countries are looking into it and looking at some, regulations in that respect. which are being put in place. So I see more, focus and more issuances in that regard, apart from the normal what we see. So the SUKUK market as a whole looks, I think, will continue with this.
Thank you.
Growth.
Thank you, Shahriman. Your last thoughts on the.
Yes, I think as I mentioned earlier, I think I really want the industry, the market actually to shift its focus rather than talking about structures and whatnot. We really need to put a lot more emphasis on the use of proceeds. How do we craft and use the use of SUKUK proceeds to actually drive meaningful change? And we actually have two big problems in the world now: climate change and social inequality. Let's put all our efforts onto that. How do we use SUKUK and its proceeds to craft a meaningful change to society?
Good point. Shamzani? Again, you are muted.
Muted. Sorry, yeah. Just a short one from me. I think back to I think we spend a lot of time talking about Standard 59 AOF. So I'll just end up with that. The market, I believe, today has gone through a period of innovation and is now heading towards standardization. So there are two factors shaping the SUKUK market at the moment. I believe firstly is the cost of funding, and secondly is standardization. So with regards to standardization, I would say that it's no longer about just mere standardization that takes, but we have to take into consideration, inclusive standardization that takes, into effect the requirements of all issuers, scholars, as well as investors. So I'll stop at that.
Thank you. Eugene?
Sure. Building on Mr. Shamzani's point, back when we issued our first exchangeable bond in 2006, we actually set up our own Sharia board to look at the compliance of the EB, and we had Sharia scholars from different jurisdictions because we were very clear we want to harmonize the acceptance of our product, as well as we want to cater to as many investors as possible. Because from an issuer point of view, it's important that accessibility to the SUKUK market is easy. If not, then the issuer will really have to consider whether that accessibility is worth it. And that's not what we want if we want to develop the market.
Thank you. Bilal, your last few points.
Sure. I think there's been very good points made in relation to standardization and harmonization along with innovation. I think the key has definitely got to be that. If we are sort of, if the standards are too strict, if we're trying to close off investor bases or for issuers or for investors, then we're limiting the SUKUK market. So I think it's just a matter of involvement of all stakeholders in that, from the standardization perspective, while keeping an eye on the development of the SUKUK market, because ultimately everyone's objective is the same.
Thank you very much. I think we have exceeded just 34 seconds beyond 4:45. I thank everyone for your, sharing your thoughts on this very important topic. So I'm sure, the audience have enjoyed and benefited from this. We do have a couple of questions raised by the members, but again, due to the shortage of time, we are unable to, to respond to this question. I hand over back the session to the moderator, to the MC. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you, Prof.
Walaikum salam. Thank you very much.
Established in 1996 as the Associations of Interest Free Banking Institutions Malaysia, IBIM was renamed to the Associations of Islamic Banking and Financial Institutions Malaysia. Currently, IBIM has 27 member banks, which comprises of 11 domestic banks, 5 development financial institutions, 10 locally incorporated foreign banks, and 1 international financial institution. Since its establishment, IBIM has played important roles within the Islamic finance industry. Among are promote sound Islamic banking system and practice, represents the interests of its members. IBIM also provides advice and assistance to members pertinent in the development on Islamic banking and finance. coordinates human capital development initiative for members. And IBIM also promotes public awareness on Islamic finance. Throughout the years, IBIM has successfully organized and coordinated various events including the Global Islamic Finance Forum, IBIM Islamic Finance Fund Run, IBIM Law Seminar, National Symposium on Islamic Banking and Finance, Kempen Seorang Sekampit Beras, Muzakarah Kewangan Islam. For more info, visit www.ibim.com and follow our Facebook account, facebook.com/myibim and Instagram @_ibim. IBIM, the Islamic Banking and Finance Voice.